One day you just stopped. You didn't announce anything. There was no argument, no final scene, no message explaining yourself. You simply stopped replying as quickly, then stopped replying at all. You let the invitations pass, and somewhere in that stretch of quiet, you realized you weren't planning to go back. To everyone else, it looked like it happened overnight. To you, it had been happening for years. That's the first thing worth understanding about this, because it's the source of almost every misunderstanding that follows. From the outside, cutting people off looks like a decision, a dramatic, deliberate act with a moment attached. From the inside, there was no moment. There was a long accumulation, and then a switch flipped, and the switch was not under your control. Think of a fuse in an old house. It doesn't blow because of one appliance. It blows because the load has been climbing for hours, and then something ordinary, a kettle, a lamp, is one thing too many. Nobody blames the lamp. The lamp wasn't the problem. The lamp was just what happened to be switched on when the limit was reached. That's what happened to you. And it's why, when people ask what they did, you often can't answer. Because the honest answer is, nothing this time. It was the 400 times before, none of which were worth mentioning on their own. That's the part that made it invisible, including to you. Every single incident was small enough to dismiss. The conversation where you got interrupted and let it go. The plan they canceled again, and you said no problem and meant it. The thing you shared that got treated as unimportant. The joke about you that everyone laughed at, and you laughed too. Being the one who always drove, always messaged first, always adjusted. Not one of those is a reason to end a relationship. If you tried to raise any of them, you'd have sounded ridiculous, and you knew it, which is exactly why you didn't, so you filed each one under its fine, and the filing is the mechanism. Because its fine doesn't delete anything, it just moves it somewhere you're not looking, and the pile keeps growing, and you keep not measuring it, until one day something small arrives. A message that goes unanswered, one more cancellation, and instead of the usual patience, there's nothing there. No irritation even, just a flat, quiet nothing where the willingness used to be. That's the moment people describe as suddenly not caring. It doesn't feel like anger. It feels like a light going off. And it's frightening because you know you should feel something and you don't. Here's what's actually happening underneath. What you're describing isn't coldness. It's a protective shutdown. When a system takes more load than it can carry for long enough, it doesn't negotiate. It cuts power, and that's not weakness or cruelty. It's the last available move for someone who never learned how to make the earlier ones. Because that's the real question hiding in all of this. Why did it have to reach the fuse at all? Most people would have said something around incident number 11. Why didn't you? Usually because you learned early that raising things costs more than swallowing them. Maybe in a house where objecting turned into a fight that lasted 3 days. Maybe with a parent whose mood decided everyone's evening, so keeping the peace was your job before you were 10. Maybe you were simply the easy one, the child who didn't cause problems, and being easy was how you earned your place. Whatever the version, you learned to absorb rather than raise. And absorbing works. It genuinely works, right up until the moment it doesn't work at all, and then it fails completely and all at once. And there's a stage before the fuse that almost nobody notices while it's happening, though you'll recognize it instantly looking back. The slow withdrawal. You start taking a little longer to reply. You stop volunteering things about your life. You go to the gathering but leave early. You're still technically there. Nobody could accuse you of anything, but the part of you that used to show up has already quietly packed. It can last months, and it's usually the last window where something could still have been said, which is exactly why so many people describe the cut as sudden. It wasn't. It was just silent. There's a physical version of this too, and it's worth knowing because it's often the first real signal. Their name appears on your phone and something in you sinks before you've read a word. The prospect of a 2-hour dinner makes you tired at 9 in the morning. You catch yourself hoping they cancel. That reaction isn't rudeness, and it isn't something you chose. It's your body finishing the accounting your mind refused to do. It had been keeping score the whole time, in a ledger you never agreed to open. That's why people like you don't have arguments. You have exits. And the exit is almost always misread. To them, you were fine, and then you were gone, so the explanation has to be that you're cold, or dramatic, or that you've changed. Some of them will tell you that you overreacted to nothing. And the maddening thing is that from their information, that's a reasonable conclusion, because they genuinely never saw the load. You never showed it to them. Not out of dishonesty, you just didn't think any single piece of it was worth mentioning. So the split is total. They experience the last 5 minutes. You experience the 4 years. And when it's family rather than friends, everything gets heavier. With friends, drifting apart is socially acceptable. People grow apart. Nobody demands a reason. With family, the distance is treated as an accusation, and you'll be asked to justify it repeatedly, usually by people who weren't in the room for any of it. Relatives will call you cold. Someone will remind you that they're your mother, as if the word settles the question, and you'll notice something strange in yourself. You can hold a completely clear head about why you left and still feel guilty every single holiday. Both of those can coexist for years. The clarity doesn't remove the guilt, and the guilt doesn't mean you were wrong. Now, the part that almost never gets said in videos about this, and the reason I wanted to make this one. The fuse works. It really does protect you. After the cut, there's usually a period of genuine relief. Quiet, uncomplicated, nothing owed to anybody. If you've been running on empty for years, that quiet can be the first rest you've had in a long time, and it's not something to feel guilty about. But a fuse has one serious flaw. It doesn't choose. It cuts the whole circuit, not the faulty part. So when it goes, it takes out everybody, including the friend who was actually good to you, the one who did show up, the one who never took more than they gave. They weren't the load, they were just on the same wire. And that's the version of this that turns into something else over time. Not rest, but a permanent policy, where the story quietly shifts from, I needed distance, to people always end up doing this, and then to it's easier alone. That's the point where the protection starts costing more than it saves, because a fuse that never gets reset isn't safety anymore. It's just a house with no electricity. So the useful question isn't, was I right to cut them off? Often you were, and you don't need permission from anyone about that. The useful question is, which one is this? Because there are two very different things that look identical from outside. One is a boundary. You removed specific people for specific reasons, and you can still name them. There's grief in it, and some anger, but the door isn't welded shut. You'd be open to someone new, you're just not going back to those. That one is healthy, even when it hurts. The other is a shutdown. It isn't aimed at anyone in particular anymore. It's aimed at everyone in advance. New people feel like risk before they've done anything. You find yourself preemptively unavailable, canceling before you can be canceled on. That one isn't protecting you from those people. It's protecting you from all people, permanently, and it slowly narrows your life down to a room where nothing can hurt you and nothing much happens. The tell between them is simple and worth being honest with yourself about. After the distance, does anything in you eventually want contact again? Even a flicker? Even with someone new? If the answer is yes, the fuse did its job and the power will come back on. If the answer is that reaching out now feels harder than it did a year ago, and getting harder, then the fuse isn't resting anymore. It's rusted in the off position. And if it's the second one, the way back is not a grand reconciliation. Nobody needs to forgive anybody. The way back is unbelievably small. One person, low stakes, short contact, a message to someone who was never part of the problem. 20 minutes of coffee with an escape route. Not because you owe anyone your presence, you don't, but because the belief people always take more than they give only ever loses power against small pieces of evidence that it isn't universally true. It also helps to know what usually goes wrong in the attempt. People coming back from a shutdown tend to try it in the hardest possible order. They go straight for the biggest relationship, the one with the most history and the most damage, and they treat the conversation like a trial where the whole thing gets decided. It almost never works, and then the failure gets used as proof that reconnecting is pointless. Start at the other end. The easiest person, the lowest stakes, the shortest contact. Not because the big one doesn't matter, because a circuit that's been off for years doesn't get tested by throwing the heaviest load at it first. And give it a longer horizon than feels reasonable. The flatness you're feeling doesn't lift in a week, and it doesn't lift because you decided it should. It lifts the way exhaustion lifts. Quietly, without announcement, and usually you only notice afterwards when you catch yourself genuinely wanting to tell someone about your day. There's one more thing worth saying, and it's the part people carry the longest. You're allowed to have needed to leave without hating anyone. A lot of people who cut off contact end up building a case afterwards, cataloging everything the other person did, keeping the anger topped up because it feels like the anger is what justifies the leaving. It isn't. You don't need them to have been monsters for your exit to have been necessary. Most of the time, they weren't monsters. Most of the time, they were ordinary people who took more than they gave and never noticed, because you made it so easy not to notice. You were allowed to stop carrying it, That's the whole justification. It doesn't require a villain. And the last thing, if you're on the other side of this now, in the quiet, wondering whether something is wrong with you because you feel so little about people you used to love, nothing is wrong with you. That flatness isn't who you are. It's what a system does after it's been overloaded, and it lifts slowly when nothing is being drawn from it. The fuse blew because the load was real. You just spent years being the only one who could feel it.